Silicon Valley and the national security state have essentially fused. You could argue that these big tech oligarchs have more influence over our government than any elected politician. Is that you can either make them safe but not effective, or you can make them effective but incredibly toxic.
How is a CIA-funded technology eliminating our constitutional rights? Is the government's shadow ruler, Palantir's founder, Peter Thiel, is the pre-crime society being implemented under the guise of public health? Today, it's minorities. Tomorrow, who's next? Whitney Webb exposes the dangerous alliance between the national security state and Silicon Valley.
Quite disturbing that Palantir has now taken over major functions of HHS, including at the CDC, and other aspects of agency functions. And because of O'Neill's deep ties to both Palantir and Peter Thiel, it's likely that he'll push for a deepening of those ties. And Palantir is really the engine that the mass surveillance state runs on. It's a contractor to every single U.S. intelligence agency, all 18 of them, as well as HHS. And it's currently operating programs within HHS that are trying to use Americans' healthcare data to try and predict when people will get sick before they show symptoms. And one of their programs with the CDC has the potential to push for the declaration of a next pandemic before anyone shows symptoms at all, and pushing for this idea that we don't have to, if in the next pandemic, we don't have to do a blanket lockdown, but based on people's healthcare data, we can decide to lock down specific cities or specific communities based on data they assess from the wastewater and things like that before people show any symptoms. But these are AI algorithms making these decisions. They are not 100% accurate. So under this paradigm, you have the potential for an algorithm that's 70 or 60% accurate to say that this city needs to be locked down based on this data, with really no transparency and no way to fight back, with major implications for the local economy and the freedom of movement for people living there, among other things. And some of the people, again, that are sort of behind Jim O'Neill and in his viewpoints, push for segmenting populations based on this data. So basically, certain populations should be given certain types of drugs, and this is quite a complicated thing when you consider that a lot of Palantir's AI specifically is known to have a very extreme racial bias, and was a major cause for concern when Palantir's Tiberius program was used as part of Operation Warp Speed to decide which populations to vaccinate with the experimental mRNA injections first. And of course, they picked mostly minority communities. So this sort of opens the door to experiment a lot of these drugs that are going to be pushed through in this deregulated paradigm on minorities, which is very, very, very unsettling.
According to Webb, Palantir's AI racial bias and predictive health programs pose a serious threat to minority communities. However, this technology is surprisingly overlooked by parts of the political spectrum, paving the way for the surveillance state to expand even further.
Yeah, it seems to be a huge blind spot about this Palantir connection for members of the MAGA movement, ignoring the connections with J.D. Vance. There's a lot to love about J.D. Vance, but you can't just, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you need to shine a light on this. And so the Palantir connections there, the money that was moved in, and now we're going to set up this mass surveillance state at the southern border. We're going to use all of this technology to monitor Americans and give away our civil liberties. Like, that's a non-starter for me. I even saw the Sean Ryan podcast a few weeks ago when they were talking about that breaking news with the bomber who went to the Trump Hotel in Vegas and blew up his Tesla Cybertruck. They were talking about Palantir, and they were both praising Palantir back and forth. And I said, what am I hearing this? Both of these guys on the Sean Ryan podcast were praising Palantir. So why do you think there's this blind spot there?
It's really hard to say, but I would argue, someone like Sean Ryan, a lot of his guests are very adjacent to the national security community, and Palantir is these days an essential part of that national security community. Like I said earlier, it's really at the heart of the mass surveillance program that is run by U.S. intelligence through every agency, essentially. And it's really, a plan that's been there since the Bush era neocons. Palantir is a direct outgrowth of this program called Total Information Awareness. that was deemed so scandalous when it was being run by the Pentagon through DARPA, that it was rightfully pointed out, even in mainstream media, that it would eliminate the constitutional right to privacy for American citizens. And when they privatized it into a private company, a lot of those concerns went away because it wasn't the government doing it; it was this private company doing it.
It's funny how that works, right?
But essentially, yes, but essentially one of the total information awareness main objectives was to sort of usher in this pre-crime society, where any sort of risk-based event, whether it's a terror attack or a pandemic or a mass shooting, will be stopped before it can start. And of course, this has a very slippery slope with civil liberties, especially when you take it, you apply it to predictive policing, which is what Palantir calls it, and what they've been piloting in U.S. cities since 2015. But really, it's pre-crime. If an AI algorithm says you're going to commit a crime that you haven't committed, how do you argue your way out of that? And then the government decides to preventatively detain you and things like that.
And Americans, you have far less chance of being killed in a terror attack in the United States. Almost 0% chance. You have more of a chance of slipping in the shower and dying. But of course, we then give up all of our civil liberties because of a potential terrorist attack.
Webb highlights how this pre-crime surveillance society erodes civil liberties. The issue isn't just with tech giants like Palantir. The focus now shifts to the controversial biotechnology connections and past of Jim O'Neill, one of Trump's key advisors.
And moving downstream of that, it's not just the history of Jim O'Neill, it's his current affiliations that I think raise cause for concern as well. So I note his current ties to biotechnology companies in the piece. And the most glaring of those is his membership on the board of directors of this company called Advantage Therapeutics. And Advantage Therapeutics is essentially marketing injections of pure aluminum, which is a known neurotoxin, and trying to market that as a cure or treatment for Alzheimer's disease, which of course is a neurodegenerative condition. And there's actually no data linking the injection of aluminum into better outcomes for Alzheimer's patients. Basically, what happened, the people behind this company previously tried to create a vaccine to treat Alzheimer's. And in the study, the control group did much better than the group that received that vaccine. But the control group was given the vaccine minus its active component, just the vaccine adjuvant or immunostimulant, which was this aluminum product. And they claim that because the control group did better, that must mean that the aluminum is a treatment for Alzheimer's. And so they got the patent rights to it and attempted to monetize it. But only the scientists affiliated with this company found that finding or, interpreted the data that way. The other people said the outcomes observed in the control group are observed in Alzheimer's patients that undergo no treatments at all. And Jim O'Neill was brought on the board specifically to market this, or to get this particular product onto the market, despite no data and despite the fact that it's a known neurotoxin, and aluminum specifically has been investigated as a causative factor in the onset of Alzheimer's. And going even beyond that is the fact that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself has fingered aluminum vaccine adjuvants as a major cause of the chronic illness epidemic in the United States, and is also a likely leading factor in the vaccine autism link. So the fact that Jim O'Neill would market the very thing that RFK Jr. has linked to these conditions as a treatment for neurodegenerative disease tells you a lot about the guy. And that I think a lot of his ambitions are very counter to the idea of making America healthy again. If one of the key culprits per RFK in this chronic illness epidemic is something that he thinks can be deceptively marketed as a cure, it's very crazy. And when you consider also that he wants to deregulate efficacy tests and sort of it's quite unsettling. And if you look at the people that he says inspired him in developing his views on deregulation, there's some of these figures that I note in the article that essentially state that big pharma should be responsible for the clinical testing of their own products, which is totally bonkers. And supposedly the ambition of the Make America Healthy Again movement is to separate take big pharma out of the regulation, take big pharma out of the FDA and that revolving door and things of that nature. And so Jim O'Neill quite clearly is not those things.
Concerned.
For Whitney Webb, O'Neill's biotech ventures reveal the dangers in his approach to public health. The roots of this threat run deeper, as Webb now sheds light on O'Neill's past role during the Bush administration in crafting policies that laid the groundwork for emergency authorizations.
Right. So as I noted in the piece, Jim O'Neill has a kind of lengthy career that spans both the private venture capital scene, and also before that, he had a stint at HHS as well during the George W. Bush era, where he was the top speechwriter for Tommy Thompson and later Mike Leavitt. And, under Tommy Thompson, he was head of HHS during the anthrax attacks and pushed for a lot of this legislation that used as justification the 2001 anthrax attacks to push through things like emergency use authorization, which have justified under emergency. So a lot of that history goes back to piggybacking off the 2001 anthrax attacks, which, if anyone's familiar with that, was essentially a false flag attack quickly tied back to the U.S. military, even though attempts were made to blame it on Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda back when the anthrax attacks first occurred. And if anyone's familiar or would like to know more about that, you can look at my series, Engineering Contagion, that I wrote several years ago during the COVID era. About that specifically. But, as top speechwriter, writing those speeches for Tommy Thompson before Congress, for example, Jim O'Neill was involved in manufacturing consent for that type of legislation and that deregulatory paradigm. That was, justified by the anthrax attacks, and also the fear mongering around the bird flu scare that was roughly between 2004 and 2006. And a lot of that fear mongering was piggybacking off of the statistics of incredibly discredited people like Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College of London, who, of course, created those doomsday statistics about COVID-19 that justified a lot of the lockdowns and other things. And, of course, his statistical modeling and all of that has since been heavily discredited, but that was the kind of modeling that was, cited by Thompson and Leavitt and others in these speeches that O'Neill was helping to write. And the extreme fear-mongering, and as well as this legislation that O'Neill helped manufacture consent for, created this entity at HHS called BARDA, which is responsible for purchasing large amounts of big pharma products under the guise of stockpiling them for emergencies. And so that was passed, and then this bird flu panic was falsely generated largely off of the fear-mongering of speeches of HHS secretaries. Wow. And doing so, they pushed for billions of dollars spent on the purchase of Tamiflu. Tamiflu is an antiviral manufactured by Gilead, and at the time, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had previously been chairman of Gilead, held an insane amount of stock in Gilead, and made over $25 million as a consequence of this huge pump and dump, basically, in Gilead stock that was, a direct consequence of the mass government purchasing of Tamiflu stockpiles that was never ultimately needed. It was basically a scam. And a lot of BARDA stockpiling over this fear-mongering of the next pandemic and all of that, a lot of these antecedents, Jim O'Neill first established in his public sector career, and then he leaves. By the way, he was also on the BARDA steering committee when those decisions were made to purchase Tamiflu as well. Jim O'Neill leaves in 2008 and enters the private sector, and he does so immediately, essentially linking up with Peter Thiel of PayPal Mafia fame. Peter Thiel, during the George W. Bush administration, had teamed up with In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm, to privatize the massive surveillance program, Total Information Awareness. Then housed at DARPA, they turned it into a private entity with CIA money, and that company, of course, is Palantir. Jim O'Neill worked at Clarium Capital and then later at Mithril Capital, where he oversaw massive investments in Palantir, and also investments in a lot of biotechnology companies, some of which were very controversial, like Ubiome, which essentially was a giant fraud, not unlike Theranos, and its co-founders were indicted on like 40 charges of fraud, and sent to prison for basically what was this giant biotech technology scam. And also at Mithril, Jim O'Neill was the superior of current Vice President J.D. Vance, so they presumably knew each other quite well.
Webb's analysis shows how O'Neill's career is intertwined with figures like Peter Thiel and Palantir. These connections are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger reality. The dangerous fusion of Silicon Valley and the national security state, cementing their influence over politics.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite clear that a lot of the big tech oligarchs feel like this is going to be a golden age for them specifically. I think it was pretty telling that at the recent inauguration, a lot of them had front row seats, including those that had been very antagonistic to Trump in previous years, like Jeff Bezos in particular, who, owns the Washington Post, which was one of the most, vocal mainstream media outlets that was, very vocally against Trump. So the fact that they're sort of being welcomed back with open arms is quite interesting. But I think, as I've argued for a few years in my work, Silicon Valley and the national security state have essentially fused. You could argue that these big tech oligarchs have more influence over our government than any elected politician, because of how dependent the government is on them for their services, whether that's Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, or any of these other companies that are becoming increasingly entangled with the U.S. government, like Palantir that I mentioned earlier. A lot of the essential functions of the government are dependent on these big tech companies now, and they, are trying to, I think, push for a new era of quote unquote innovation and things like AI and things like that, but that would necessarily necessitate greater AI adoption. And so, some of these entities that developed the AI roadmap for the United States, like the National Security Commission on AI, was saying in 2019 that, in-person shopping needs to be eliminated. Facial recognition needs to be more widespread on American streets. Basically, we have to forcibly expand the user base for all of this AI technology. And the best way to do that is through government policy. And so a lot of these announcements, for example, with Stargate and their AI data centers, the teaming up of, OpenAI now becoming a major government contractor, and, Sam Altman saying we need to rewrite the social contract as a consequence of the impacts AI will have on society, and things of that nature. And how Palantir is basically becoming one of the AI engines on which, society, not just the public sector, but also a lot of the private sector is now running. A lot of these oligarchs have outsized influence on our world, and maybe Bill Gates isn't chairman of Microsoft anymore, but he certainly has a lot of influence in the big tech scene. He's a major investor in a lot of infrastructure companies through his various investment firms, and a lot of those investments, of course, have been made in biotechnology. He made a massive amount of money off of vaccines, particularly in the COVID era. The U.S. government has never stopped funding one of his brain children, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. We give them billions and billions of dollars, and have ever since they were created. And they're one of the biggest funders of the World Health Organization, for example. So even though Trump exited from the WHO, we are still funding, organizations that partner with the WHO and fund the WHO. Bill Gates funds the WHO, I'm pretty sure, directly as an individual through his foundation.
Yes,
and so
does,
sort of cozying up to him. Yeah. So I think cozying up to him, is problematic in a lot of ways. And the fact that he, in particular, was so enthusiastic after his conversation with Trump about how there would be some sort of acceleration of vaccine innovation, similar to what happened in 2020, which is presumably a reference to Operation Warp Speed and the emergency use authorization paradigm. I would argue that seems to be Bill Gates signaling that there's enthusiasm on the part of the current administration to allow a lot of these mRNA products onto the market. But as we knew during COVID, and also as is still apparent, a lot of these mRNA products under the current regulatory paradigm cannot even make it through animal trials. So there would have to be a great reduction in the rigor of clinical testing, which is already arguably ridden with conflicts of interest depending on the contractor doing that testing. And you could argue that some of those tests aren't rigorous enough, or there's also a revolving door with, those agencies and big pharma, things like that. I think, people need to be very concerned about mRNA technology, and that we shouldn't necessarily be hoping that the government, even with this administration, will save us from it.
According to Webb, the growing power of tech giants is shaping the future of controversial technologies like mRNA. She warns against focusing on political figures, arguing that the core policy agendas that mobilized voters must not be overlooked, shifting the focus to the real battleground.
I think the best we can probably, or something we can probably push for and hopefully get, is that. Sure. Well, so my focus tends to be on policy and policy agendas. And I think, especially coming out of an electoral season, people tend to get very invested in people. And sometimes people don't necessarily stick to policy agendas. They promote it on the campaign trail, and tend to sort of, I think, myopically focus on some of the narratives around the people at the expense of paying attention to the policy agendas they ostensibly oppose. So, as it relates to things like mRNA technology, for example, a lot of people that have been pretty prominent in opposing that have sort of glossed over some of the statements recently from people like Larry Ellison, of the CEO of Oracle at the White House, talking about personalized mRNA cancer vaccines. A lot of people that railed against mRNA technology a year or two ago have been unusually silent about that. Of course, not everyone. But some have, presumably at the expense of, they don't want to necessarily criticize the incoming administration, but there are some, troubling signs as it relates to mRNA technology specifically. And if this was a major reason for people backing the Make America Healthy Again movement in particular, which has been credited with a lot of Trump's electoral success more recently, it's important to note that that policy agenda does matter to voters, and sort of focusing on, confirming this person or that person, or as long as this person got in, everything will magically be fine. I mean, that doesn't necessarily happen, as we know that in politics, a lot of deal making happens, a lot of backpedaling can happen, a lot of compromises happen that can, be at the expense of those policy agendas that voters really cared about. And so, I tend to focus on the policy agendas and sort of try and avoid a lot of the focus on politicians specifically, because, I think people, it happened with Obama. I think it's happened with Trump to an extent, this idea of hope and change and sort of these savior politics, that as long as, we get the right person in the White House, we can all sit back in our armchairs and trust the plan. I kind of reject that. I think it's up to everybody to focus on policy agendas that they oppose, and if those start to be pushed through, that they get vocal about it, regardless of who's pushing about it or making excuses for it. Personally, I guess that has ruffled some feathers in my case, and not necessarily cheerleading people. Has gotten me called a lot of names recently. But ultimately, I'm concerned about certain policy agendas, and I haven't changed in that. So a lot of the policy agendas I've been focused on for years really is the expansion of mass surveillance, the erosion of civil liberties, the imposition of technocracy, and also the imposition of this biotechnology that is deceptively marketed as safe and effective. When we learned during COVID, it is neither of those things. As we'll talk about today, as it relates to Jim O'Neill, there's efforts. His big push is to eliminate efficacy testing for drugs and vaccines, which would be a total gift to the biotechnology products that produced mRNA, because essentially what's been known for years since this technology first emerged around 2010 is that you can either make them safe but not effective, or you can make them effective but incredibly toxic. And so by eliminating efficacy tests, you can flood this on the market. And there's really, if you look into this guy's background, there's really, it's unlikely there will be any sort of imposition of rules that would prevent deceptive marketing of those things. And there's certainly ways to get this into people's bodies without necessarily having mandates. For example, and that could include a big pharma collusion with private insurance companies. It could include, getting mRNA into the food supply, which is being done with livestock, among other things. So again, if people are concerned in the MAHA movement, particularly about mRNA technology, it's important to look at the policy action and not so much the policy rhetoric if you want to avoid interacting with those type of substances at all personally.
Right. So again, I think that's very, very important. And there's no subject on this show that's not allowed. So we're not afraid to tackle any subject here on the show. And we're not cheerleading for anybody. And I think we warned people during the campaign, like, hey, human beings are fallible. They make huge mistakes, and we got to call them out. We were very vocal last week during that mRNA weird press conference with President Trump that kind of came out of nowhere. But I want to ask you, so we got a lot of ground to cover. I want to get into RFK, and I want to talk about your piece. So you've just written a new piece. All the focus has been on RFK Jr. as the head of HHS, but as Deputy Secretary, Jim O'Neill, basically, as you say in your piece, would essentially function as the chief operating officer of the department. He would oversee the day-to-day operations and everything. So who is Jim O'Neill, and why should we know about him?
Well, I think
after stressing the importance of focusing on policy agendas, Webb now highlights a key figure who will implement them, while RFK Jr. may be the face. She warns that the real operational power will lie with his deeply problematic deputy, Jim O'Neill.
They've sort of stacked the cards against him, but there have been, reports over the past couple of weeks citing people in Trump's and also Kennedy's orbit that he's not planning to focus in vaccines, at least for the first significant part of his term as HHS secretary. He's looking instead to score smaller wins in the fields of exercise and food. So I think, the fact that since he's endorsed Trump, he's been pretty mum on biotech issues and instead focused on things like seed oils and beef tallow and things like this, sort of, if these recent reports are any indication, maybe sort of looking to go in those directions. Perhaps there's less resistance there. But I think a lot of the people that voted for him have concerns about this technology. And so instead of blindly trusting that those concerns will be, enshrined by this administration, I think because of people like Jim O'Neill and people like Heather Flick, it's important to pay attention to what is actually going on with the policy agendas. And I think that's also true for the person who's been appointed to be head of the FDA, who I believe also has to be confirmed, Marty Makary, who, according to biotech CEOs, his appointment was like dodging a bullet. And a lot of biotech stocks rose on the news of his appointment because he's very supportive of getting a lot of these products on the market faster. And actually, during the COVID-19 situation, he argued that that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines should have been approved within 24 hours, which is quite fast, and wouldn't really, in my opinion, give a lot of room to look at any sort of the downsides there. So again, I think, as I've said many times, there are certain policies where the solutions to, those policies that people don't like lie outside of electoral solutions necessarily. Sometimes we can't trust politicians because of, how the current system is structured and backroom wheeling and dealing. We have to sort of focus on building parallel systems, developing informed consent. A lot of that depends on a truly independent media, reporting on these things, even when they're not convenient or maybe don't necessarily make us feel warm and fuzzy. If we want to avoid these types of things in our food supply or our medical supply, we need to be, as focused as we can on the facts, see when these things are advancing, and if you're concerned about them, find alternative ways to treat certain conditions or alternative ways to source your meat, for example, and support companies that aren't using this type of technology if it's not something that you want to have in your body, and that we should at the very least be lobbying for informed consent about the stuff if this administration is insistent about flooding the market with mRNA products. Quite disturbing that Palantir has now taken over major functions of HHS, including at the CDC and other aspects of agency functions. And because of O'Neill's deep ties to both Palantir and Peter Thiel, it's likely that he'll push for a deepening of those ties. And Palantir is really the engine that the mass surveillance state runs on. It's a contractor to every single U.S. intelligence agency, all 18 of them, as well as HHS. And it's currently